Hi, friends of rest. This is Sabbatical Jeff here. And for the Sabbath Innovation Lab video this week, I want to share with you about one of my favorite places in the world. It is called Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island. I've had the good fortune of traveling there twice, once many years ago with some seminary students, and then this past summer in July with my beloved Carolyn. On a 3-week trip to England and Scotland, we were able to stay on Lindisfarne Island for a long weekend. And Lindisfarne is on the northeast coast of England. And so I'm going to tell you about this, what I think is a magical place and its kind of spirituality and what it has to tell us about Sabbath and keeping rhythms of Sabbath uh, alive in our lives. So let me share this little presentation and the story of Lindisfarne. So here is Carolyn and I when we first arrived on the island in July, and we got there in time to see a beautiful sunset and with some lovely sheep in the background there. And we could even hear the seals as they were wailing out in the water. It was a beautiful moment and the beginning of our journey there on Lindisfarne. Now, Lindisfarne is known as one of the birthplaces of Celtic Christianity. Now, Iona is the better known kind of island where Celtic Christianity first took root in Scotland on the western coast. But Lindisfarne is also a place where Celtic Christianity took root. As a bishop from Iona came, and in 635, Saint Aidan started a monastery on Lindisfarne Island. Now, what you're looking at here are some ruins from a later cathedral that was built in the 1300s, along with a priory for the monks to live in. So there was this beautiful cathedral and this priory where monks lived. And there in the distance, you can see Lindisfarne Castle, a little castle that was built in the 15th century. But Lindisfarne may be most known for being the place where the Vikings landed. Yes, the Vikings landed here in the ninth century, and they pretty much destroyed everything and took everything. And so there's a lot of Viking lore that's associated with Lindisfarne. This was the first spot where they landed as they started their kind of takeover of different parts of England. And the monastery was attacked, but it came back and it's continued to exist after the attack of the Vikings. This is a stone that was found and is dated to the year around 900. It is called the Battle Stone of Lindisfarne. It was found shortly after the Vikings were there. On one side, you can see how the stone has an image of people praying, hands that may be the hands of God, the moon, and the sun. And then on the other side of it is the image of these warriors, most likely the Vikings. It was a headstone that was found as some sort of memorial or commemoration of the tragic day the Vikings came to Lindisfarne. And there is Saint Aidan, the saint who started the original monastery in 635. And here is a statue of Saint Cuthbert. He is also a well-known Celtic saint associated with Lindisfarne. He came after Saint Aidan, and in fact, when Saint Aidan died on Lindisfarne, Cuthbert was out in the field with his sheep, and he saw these angels descending from heaven and taking a soul up into heaven. And the next day, he discovered that Saint Aidan had passed. And so this inspired him to then go join the monastery, which he did at Melrose. And many years later, after being a hermit on an island for 9 years, he was invited to be the Bishop of Lindisfarne. And reluctantly, he did eventually agree to do that. This is St. Cuthbert's Shrine in Durham Cathedral that we visited on the way to Lindisfarne, where his remains now reside. And this is just another view of the beautiful ruins of the cathedral that used to be on Lindisfarne. And there again is the castle. Now, the beauty of Lindisfarne, and something I haven't mentioned yet, is that it's a tidal island. So, what that means is the tide comes in and you cannot get onto or off of the island. It is completely surrounded with water at that time. And when the tide goes out, then the causeway or the roadway is open and people drive on and off of the island. So it's only fully an island when the tide comes in. But what this does is creates a rhythm of life on the island where the tide comes in and goes out twice a day. Now, one of the things about Lindisfarne is it is connected to a community known as the Northumbria community, out of which the Celtic Daily Prayer Book has come to us. If you're familiar with that resource, a wonderful book of Celtic prayers. And on Lindisfarne itself is one of the authors of that book, Andy Rain. And I got to meet with him 14 years ago with the seminary students. That's why we visited there. And I was fortunate enough to also meet with him again when Carolyn and I visited this past July. But here's the book, which I took with me, of course. And one day, oh, and there's Andy, because we got to meet up with him and go to church with him, attended Mass with him. And I had Andy take us out to this little magical spot on the island that are known as the monk prayer holes or lookout holes. They're these little indentations into the cliff looking out over the water where the monks used to go and pray. And this is what they would look out on when the tide had come in. That island there is known as St. Cuthbert's Island because that is where Cuthbert would frequently go to pray. When the water or the tide would go out, you can walk over to it, and Cuthbert would go over and stay on it sometimes as the tide would come in and out. And there is the tide tables that you have to pay attention to if you're going to come onto or get off of the island. So on this island, this tidal rhythm is built in. And so the people and the tourists could only come on certain times of day. When we were there during the weekend, they would come around 9 a.m. in the morning because the tide was out. And then everybody would be leaving the island by 2 or 3 p.m. as the tide was about to come back in. So in the evenings, we kind of had this magical sense when most everybody was off the island. People definitely live on the island and some were staying there like us, but it was mostly empty. And you just kind of felt this kind of isolation and quietness that would just descend over the island. And we would take these long walks around the island at that time and watch the sunset as the tide would be fully in, so no one could get on or could get off the island. And while I was there on July 13th, the reading from the Celtic prayer book was about Lindisfarne and about these tides. And what I want to do is read this reading to you and then share my own reflections from my journal from that day. So, on the small island of Lindisfarne, the tidal borders are forever changing. Tourists come to the island in their thousands, sometimes thousands in one day, and then the tide starts to close again and they leave. The island inhabitants move from hyperactivity into a time of quiet and peace. And it is necessary to let the silence come around you as it is to let the pilgrims mill around you. We who live on Lindisfarne are privileged to have this natural rhythm. Most people have to create this rhythm in their busy lives. It is wonderful to recall how St. Aidan also came here to live a life of quiet adoration and then of activity, like the rhythm of the tides. And here is my reflection on thinking about the tides of Lindisfarne. The Celtic prayer reading today is about Lindisfarne. And I love reading about Lindisfarne while on Lindisfarne. It's about how the tides create a unique rhythm of life, a time when the island is busy with pilgrims, seekers, and those that are on holiday, and then a time when the island is with silence and rest. A natural rhythm of activity and of rest, of noise and of quiet, built in by the tide. Our bodies have their natural rhythms as well, the need for activity and rest. While their tide cannot be ignored and its rhythms must be obeyed, at least the tides of Lindisfarne cannot be ignored and its rhythms must be obeyed, we can completely ignore our body's desire and need for rest. We push on and on in some vain effort to get ahead or get it all done, and we pay the price of anxiety, weariness, physical illness, emotional distress, spiritual aridity. In theory, they could build a bridge from the mainland to Holy Island that would enable visitors to ignore the tides, the flows, the natural rhythms of life. People could come and go all day and night. And how awful would that be? It would take away much of the beauty of this place if it was accessible 24/7. How wonderful it is to be on this island when the tide is in, trapped, no way to leave, only able to be and knowing no one is coming for you or can even get to you. A gift of grace it is to live this way. But we build too many bridges around the natural flow and tides of our lives. We ignore the times our bodies are calling for us to rest and to be. We wade into the water and try to swim to the other shore. I imagine the monks living at Lindisfarne at a time when you could only walk across to get there. What a different way of living. One of peace and routine, nature and connection. I'm sure it had its own struggles, hardships, human things, and uncertainty, but also maybe it was different, simple, personal, engaged. And of course, even then, life can enter and disrupt in not so good ways. The Vikings were an awful reality. Henry VIII ended the presence of monasteries there because he could. So, yes, life and suffering still visit even this place. But it still offers an insight how to live even in the suffering and the struggle. It invites us to pay attention to the rhythms of our lives, our bodies, our spirits, and to take them seriously, to work and to rest, to be active and to be still, to make joyful noise and to listen to the silence. This is what Lindisfarne wants to teach us. We would do well to heed its lessons. So, friends, I invite us to consider this day our own tidal rhythms, our need for rest and play, as well as work and activity. What are the rhythms of your body, of your spirit, inviting you to? How are you being invited to deeper places of rest? In what ways do you then try to build bridges around those rhythms to maybe do more than you should, to get around what you're being invited to in terms of a deeper Sabbath practice? So that is my reflections from my time at Lindisfarne Island. And I hope that you and I will consider our own tide tables, so to speak, and recognize our own need for rest as well as work. And I pray that each of you will find some good rest this day. Amen.